let's move on to 8 guideposts that are kind of fundamental to the study of economics. That is, they're fundamental to the approach we take here, right? So in economics, it's a science, it's a social science, we're studying people, and so we're kind of taking a logical and rational approach as we study people. And so these 8 guideposts are kind of part of that, is kind of how to, think like an economist or analyze the economy like we do in economics, okay? So the first one is just this simple idea that follows from what we just talked about. And what we just talked about is the fact that in our world today, in our world always, we had to deal with scarcity. Right? So scarcity forces us to make choices. And so the first point here is that the use of scarce resources is costly. So any choice we make involves a trade-off. That is, there's something we give up when we make a choice. And that's what we call opportunity cost. Right? So opportunity cost is what we give up when we make a choice. Okay? So, or another way to say it, and this is a kind of a very common way to see it in textbooks, is that it is the next best alternative when we make a choice. Let me illustrate that with an example. So, suppose I have a student who, wisely decides to come to class. We'll call this student, I don't know, let's call this student Doug. Okay. Now, Doug can do a lot of different things with his time, right? So let's list the different possibilities, different things he could be doing if he didn't come to class. So, let's see, option A, maybe he'd rather be eating. Option B, let's see, perhaps, watching some TV. So watching a movie. Watching a movie. Okay. What else? Let's see, option C, maybe a little exercise, a little Pilates, Pilates, I think that's how you spell it. Or maybe D, doing a little yoga. Let's see, what else could he be doing? Maybe, I don't know, eating, watch a movie, Pilates, yoga. Maybe going shopping. Okay. So Doug wisely decides to come to class. And so we could ask Doug, basically say, okay, if you were to rank these, what's the next best thing you'd rather be doing if you didn't have to come to class? And my guess is, let's see, maybe he would pick, I don't know, watching a movie. So this, when Doug comes to class, his next best option, that is what he'd be doing if he wasn't coming to class, is what we call his opportunity cost. It's not all those options, right? Because you don't get to do everything at once. It's the next best thing. It's the next thing that you give up, okay? So that's the idea of opportunity cost. And this is the way economists think about costs, because it's actually a more accurate way, because a lot of times costs are not just money, right? It's time, it's people. So a lot of times costs can't be represented with money. If we choose to spend time with one person and not another, the cost is time with that other person, right? It's not some sort of monetary thing. So opportunity cost is kind of the more full or complete way that we think about cost in economics. All right, guidepost 2. That is when we're thinking about the way people make choices. we generally assume that people choose purposefully. That is, we're trying to make ourselves better off. Okay, we try to get the most from our limited resources. So we generally assume that people are rational, people are self-interested, and that when they make choices, they're trying to make themselves better off. Right? So trying to make themselves better off. Okay. Now, this is a pretty good assumption. Again, no one does this perfectly, right? We all make mistakes, but the mistakes, right? It's not like we get up in the morning and we're like, man, how can I really screw up my life today? That's really what I want to do today. No one wakes up thinking that, right? Now, we might make some poor choices throughout the day, but those are mistakes. It's not like we intend to screw up our life, okay? And so this assumption that for the most part, people are going to make choices that make themselves better off is a pretty good assumption. Now, it doesn't mean we take this to the extreme, right? That everyone's going to be a greedy bastard. What it means is you're making choices to make yourself better off, right? And a lot of times that means making your family better off, your friends better off, the people around you better off. That's what we mean by being self-interested, okay? All right, the third point or guidepost here is fundamental, and it is simply stated as incentives matter. That is, when we're making choices, the incentives that we experience or confront when we're making a choice are going to affect our decisions, right? So incentives will influence the choices we make. This is just a simple fundamental insight that is a lot of times, forgotten about, right? Especially when we think about laws and rules and regulations. A lot of times laws and rules and regulations forget about the fact that incentives matter. So sometimes we might change a law and we get an outcome that's not what we expected. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's because we changed the incentives, right? So I have a flower here on this slide, and it's a way to kind of talk about an example of changing incentives, right? So in this class, you're going to get a grade. Grade serves as an incentive, right? So we are trying to encourage you to study, to work hard, to do well in your classes, to learn the material, because that's what we're trying to do. We're a college. We want you to study and to do well, because when you get out there in the working world and you do well in the working world, you make us look good, right? So the way we incentivize that is with a grade. You get a good grade, you get to put it on your transcript, you get to have a high GPA, and then it's easier to get a job and so forth, right? So a grade very much is an incentive for you to do well in this course. Do well, you get a high grade. Do poorly, you get a low grade, right? Now, suppose I change the incentive. Suppose I change grades. Suppose I say, grades A, B, C, D, F. Ooh, just so harsh, so mean. Suppose I change grading to flowers and hugs. All right, we just keep track. Real awkward hugs. And we just keep track of that, right? You say something intelligent or you ask an insightful question, and I say, well, that's a really good question. I give you a flower. I go over there. I give you like one of those really awkward professor hugs. And then we just keep track. So at the end of the semester, I say, okay, I'm going to put 85 flowers and 67 awkward hugs on your transcript, right? You're as a student, you'd be like, what the hell is this, right? And on your transcript, it would make no sense. Like, it wouldn't be a very good incentive, right? And many of you would probably stop putting out that much effort in the course. Besides, who the heck wants an awkward hug from the professor, right? So I changed the incentive, and you would probably change your behavior. You would change the choices you make. You would come to class less because it's weird. This guy's giving me flowers, right? So that's the key idea. Incentives matter. Incentives influence the choices we make. And so if you change the incentives, the choices or outcomes or the choices people make are going to change as well. Okay. All right. Guidepost 4. We make decisions at the margin. So let me explain what this means. This is, I guess you could call it an assumption we make, but it describes the way people make choices, right? And when people make choices, we make incremental choices. That is, we're never making choices over the whole. A lot of times we're making choices about having one more, right? Do I have one more? Okay. So when you decided to come to college, you didn't decide all the classes you were going to take, right? Every semester you decide, what are the next classes I'm going to take, right? You're making marginal decisions. What are those additional classes I'll take? What should I take next? Just like when you're, decide to have some cookies. Right? It's not like you sit down and you're like, dang it, I'm going to have 10 cookies. No, you sit down and you take one cookie and you eat it and you're like, wow, the cookie's really good. I'm going to have a second cookie. Before you know it, you've consumed 10 cookies, right? Each choice you're making is usually one more, an additional cookie. What are the additional classes I take, right? What do I buy for groceries this week, right? That's what we mean by margin. It's always these additional or incremental choices we make, okay? And so we're never making choices about the whole. It's usually we're making choices over additional amounts. Okay, yeah, it's not like at the beginning of every year we figure out what we're going to eat for every meal for the whole year. We think about each meal as we go. Okay, so that's what we mean by we make decisions at the margin. That is, we're engaging in what's called marginal decision making. That is incremental choices. Okay. Guidepost 5. When we're making these choices, we're going to need to gather information. So Guidepost 5 says, look, information helps us to make better choices, but we live in an imperfect world. Getting that information is costly, right? We have to put out some work and effort to get that information, right? So let's think about this. When you decided to go to college, okay, what information did you have to gather? Well, you had to learn about schools, right? So you wanted to learn where the school is, location, what's the acceptance rate, right? What are the test scores that are required, right? So requirements to go there. Right? Many of you probably visited the schools you were considering, right? You probably came and participated in the tours or day on campus or scholars weekend or things like that. All that, you were basically gathering information, right? And so you gathered enough information and then you made a choice. Right? You chose to come to Florida Southern, okay? Now, you could have gathered more information, right? You maybe could have camped out on campus and watched people more. You could have dug through the dumpsters to learn even more about what campus life is like. But right, that's costly. You give up time and you got to dig through dumpsters. I'm sure that's not fun, right? So we gather information when we're making a choice up to a point. We gather enough information to help us make a choice, and then we make a choice, okay? And so this information, or our ability to gather this information, is going to kind of determine the choices we make, right? And so that's why today, the internet, that's the answer to this question here. What invention has helped our modern world reduce the cost of acquiring information? The internet. It's magical. Right? Think about evaluating colleges before the internet, right? You couldn't look up pictures. You couldn't look up, reviews. You couldn't find out what the acceptance rate is, right? All you could do is just basically go visit campus. Maybe your high school guidance counselor would have a brochure or two of some different schools. That was pretty much it, right? You probably knew a lot about the schools your parents went to because that's where they went, right? But before the internet, it was difficult to find out information on schools. Now you can look at pictures and reviews and ratings and virtual tours and so forth, right? So it doesn't mean gathering information is always incredibly costly, right? Modern inventions make it easier and easier to gather information. Okay, guidepost 6. We hinted at this earlier, but economic actions often generate secondary effects, okay? That is, the choices we make can sometimes have unintended consequences, okay? So we call these outcomes we didn't intend, we call them secondary effects, okay? And it's the unintended impact of an economic action, right? So I've got kind of an example on the next slide, and maybe I'll just move it here. All right, example. So I grew up in a family with a bunch of siblings, and we basically just raised Cain all day. It was mostly brothers, and it was great. We beat up on each other all the time. In the summertime, we used to love to build what we called lakes or ponds. They were really just big fat mud puddles. But as kids, we thought it was these big, huge lakes and ponds. So we would dam up this creek that ran through our property. We were like beavers. We would dam it up to basically make this, what we called a lake or a pond. It was really just a big, fat, disgusting mud puddle. Okay, so we would build little ponds as kids. Now, the reason why we did this, right, the economic action, was because it was fun. And we were going to go play in it and splash around and beat each other up and just do what general kids want to do, right? So, turns out there's a secondary effect. One that we did not intend. Right? Well, what tends to breed in large, standing, stagnant bodies of water in the summertime? Yep, mosquitoes. So, bred mosquitoes like crazy. My dad hated it. Right, so he eventually would go down, destroy our dams. Of course, we would complain because all these mosquitoes just breeding in these little ponds we would make, right? It's not like we were intending to make mosquitoes. We just happened to provide habitats that mosquitoes loved, right? So that's an example of a secondary effect. It was not what we intended, but it was something we caused by our economic choice, okay? All right. Guidepost 7. The value of a good or service is subjective, okay? Now, what this means is that everybody's different, and each of us is going to value a good differently. Okay, so everyone is different. And will value goods differently. Okay. Value is subjective. It's not objective. We can't measure what somebody's value for a good is going to be. Okay, so even though sometimes in economics we talk about utility and happiness and satisfaction, we still mean it in a subjective way, right? There's no way to objectively measure somebody's happiness, and we can't assume that we know what that is. Okay, and that's why I have this phrase down here. Remember the utilitarians? This was a movement of philosophical thought in the 1800s where they actually argued that you could objectively know or measure happiness and satisfaction, right? Which you can't really do. The downside is that kind of from utilitarian thought, you kind of got some bad outcomes. This is the idea of the ends justify the means. That is, we can make some people better off if we bump off some other people. And generally, those are things that lead to genocide, and that's generally bad. And so when we talk about value and utility and happiness and satisfaction in economics, we mean it in a subjective way. Right? There's no way to know how people value things. They all value them differently, and they're going to express those values in the marketplace when they buy something. They're going to be willing to pay more for one good and pay less for another good because that's the different way they value things. Okay, so our last guidepost here, guidepost 8, basically says, look, economics is a science. It's a social science. Okay, so we have to use a scientific method, right? We need to have theories, and the theories have to match reality. That is, we should be able to test them and see if they make sense, okay? So that's why we say the test of a theory is its ability to predict, right? So if we're going to have ideas about the way people act or make choices, if it doesn't accurately describe the way they're making choices, then that's a pretty bad theory, okay? And so our theories let me write it this way. Our theories need to describe the real world. All right. That is, we need to test our theories. And if our theory does not do a very good job of describing the real world, we need to throw it out. Okay. So economics means we have to use a scientific method, right? We have to test our ideas to see if they match the way people are making choices. Okay.